Welcome to our Energy Connect studio at COP28. I'm delighted to be joined in the studio today by Chris Seiple, Vice Chair, Power Renewables at Wood Mackenzie. Chris, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having us.
Now, we're here at COP28. You said you arrived yesterday.
Yes, yeah.
What are you looking forward to at COP28, and what's your thoughts about what it can bring to help accelerate the energy transition?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I'm just looking forward to is it's amazing to kind of just see the scale of what COP has become, the enormous amount of people that are here, the enormous amount of companies that are here, kind of, just trying to have a dialogue and move forward on what's one of the world's biggest challenges, which is decarbonizing our sector. And I'm looking very curious to see what comes out of it. Already substantial achievement in terms of methane, commitments to methane reduction, commitments to attempting to scale up the amount of renewables that we're adding, already having success in kind of tackling this problem of how do we decarbonize the developing world and how do we finance all of that. So already kind of a lot that has come out of that.
Absolutely, yeah. I've been watching the last few days, and that's really good to see.
Yeah, it's great to see that progress.
And in your view, in your Wood Mackenzie, what's your outlook for the energy transition?
Yeah, and I think that question helps put COP into context. So we have roughly 2,500 researchers across the globe tackling kind of analysis, analytics, data on all parts of the energy value chain, including even the metals and mining sector. And once a year, we go through a process where we bring together all the analysis across all of those groups to develop a view on what kind of trajectory are we on with the policies that we have today and the technology roadmaps that countries have. And when we do that analysis right now, that analysis shows us being on, given the current policies we have, a trajectory to limit climate change to about 2.5 degrees. And I think that helps put COP into context because we already have the Paris Accord, where we have, coming out of the Paris Accord, pledges that if we met those objectives would limit climate change to only 2 degrees, which is still not kind of the scientific consensus of what needs to be done. And so it's, we are, even without further commitments, we're not really on track to be able to limit climate change to even the commitments that have already been made. And so the things like methane, in particular financing of the developing countries, are really, really important. But there's the scale of what needs to be done to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees is a bit daunting from our perspective.
Absolutely. I think that's true for everyone.
Yeah.
And I want to get your views on, you mentioned scaling up, and I think in different areas of energy that's going to be really important. But I wanted to focus on the power sector.
Yeah.
What are the challenges there to really scale up grids around the world, and obviously different country regions and more advanced positions. But how important is that going to be?
It's incredibly important because electricity is the most important fuel source to being able to decarbonize our globe as a whole. And clearly the biggest challenge from the power perspective side of it is the scaling of the grids that needs to happen. And I think we're trying to decarbonize and meet a net zero target by 2050, right? And today in the US and Europe, as examples, if you're a developer wanting to build a new power plant, if you start that process of developing that power plant today, the earliest that power plant is going to come online and actually come into the grid is 2028, 2029, 2030. So, and that's kind of best case, right? So you're looking at timelines of 7 to 10 years to be able to build a new power plant. And one of the critical factors to actually getting that power plant online is being able to have the grid capacity to be able to connect it. And the timelines for that, in Europe and the US in particular, are 10 plus years to develop those lines. And so we're kind of running out of time very quickly to be able to scale up the grid capacity that's needed to accommodate just the renewables that we need to bring online. And then there's all the grid capacity that we need to accommodate the growth of new sources of demand for electricity, like electrification of cars and hydrogen, right? Hydrogen production from renewable resources will be connected to the grid and need to run through wires. So we have a real challenge there. One of the interesting things, is that there are companies that have now developed technologies that can be used to increase the capacity of the existing grid. This is an area I think that needs a lot more focus with government policymakers focused on how do you create those incentives so that we expand the existing grid just as fast as we are adding, expand the capacity of the existing grid as well as building new lines and things like that. So that's clearly one of the biggest challenges to scaling it. I think the other challenge is just the scaling of the industry itself to accommodate this amount of growth. The progress that has been made is incredible. I think this year we will install 30% more renewables across the globe than we did last year. But if we really want to meet a 1.5 degree target, we need to double the amount of renewable capacity that we're adding to the grid by the end of this decade. And doubling of that capacity means a lot more manufacturing capacity. It means that we need a lot more experienced engineers and tradesmen who know how to add all of this capacity and have that capability, and even scaling of the metals and mining industry as well to be able to kind of support all of the metal needs associated with scaling the transmission sector.
Yeah, no, so a lot to come, and you mentioned a few of the industries there. What sort of opportunities around not traditional renewable energy sectors, but solar and wind, which I think the general public know more about. What are the opportunities there, and what are the challenges sort of those renewable energy sectors are facing?
Yeah, well, first of all, increasingly, because solar and wind uses land, I actually think local opposition, kind of NIMBYism, people who don't want solar and wind panels in their backyard, is an increasing challenge for the industry to solve. And just because we're going to have more and more prevalence of wind farms, of solar across the globe. The second big challenge associated with solar and wind, it just comes back to the grid infrastructure challenge. It's particularly challenging with wind, where the wind tends not to be located where large demand centers are. So economic additions of wind require this grid infrastructure to scale them out. I would say, though, somebody who's young, early in their career, like the scale of the opportunities in the renewable industry over the course of the next 20 years are going to be enormous, because that is how we're going to kind of decarbonize our grid. And as I was saying, it's going to require a lot of humans to kind of scale up the industry. So enormous opportunity for both investors, as well as people wanting to come into this business.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, talking about grids and what renewable energy, but another element is going to be, the importance of energy storage connected to that.
Yeah.
Which again maybe doesn't get as much focus, but I assume will really need to be, focused on.
Yeah, and that's actually the third obstacle I was going to touch on, Julian, is that the other problem with solar and wind that kind of limits the scale of the opportunity is that we only have solar power when the sun's shining, and we only have wind when the wind is blowing. And we're trying to solve for this dilemma of how do you ensure affordability while also keeping the grid reliable and doing it in an economic and sustainable way. And storage certainly plays a critical role in that. And I think the good news is, with the cost reductions that we've had in solar, wind, and storage, producing a kilowatt hour of electricity in a sustainable way is no longer that expensive, which is why we're seeing the scaling of this industry now. But the challenge that we have is providing a kilowatt hour of reliable supply in a sustainable way is still very expensive. And so back to your question about storage, providing energy, battery storage that can supply power for 2 hours or 4 hours That is becoming a lot more economic. Main place we're seeing a lot of investment in storage right now is in the United States. We need to see a lot more in other parts of the world to help scale the solar industry. But we really have an unsolved challenge in how we provide kind of much longer term storage and seasonal storage or baseload power from technologies like nuclear and geothermal, which to date are much more expensive than renewables.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. And then again, loop back to we're here at COP, and it's bringing governments, lobbyists, industries all together, sort of looking at how we can meet these challenges. And I think that probably links to are trade policies going in the right directions, or probably hope to see more coming out of this COP in that regards.
Yeah, so I think in trade policy as it relates to renewable energy in particular, what is most prevalent in the discussion right now is the reliance really that everybody in the globe has on China for manufacturing of renewables and really kind of the whole supply chain on the metals and mining sector. And so, it's amazing what percentage of the cost of building a solar facility in the United States is now related to politics. Because we have tariffs in place that we put on Chinese imports. We have limited the types of polysilicon produced in China that can be used in the United States. And as a result of these types of policies, you can buy a solar module anywhere in the globe outside of the United States right now for around 15 to 20 cents a watt, whereas in the United States, the cost of that module is almost double what it is on the global market. And so there's a real tension right now between the cost of decarbonizing, the desire in Europe and the US to have renewables manufacturing sector result in industry jobs, and also the energy security concerns about the worries about being dependent on China for all of our sources of renewable energy technology. And it's prevalent in solar, or a critical concern in solar and wind, solar and storage. But it's also increasingly a concern in the wind industry as well, where you have Western wind manufacturers that are struggling with profitability, and you're now seeing kind of Chinese wind producers come into the wind market as well. And so that's a real area of tension, with also a lot of trade-offs on cost if we have these kind of trade barriers as it relates to our dependence on the US and European dependence on China.
Absolutely, Chris. Well, we'll look and see how that develops.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank you for coming down to the Energy Next studio at COP28, and hope you have a great COP yourself. I'm sure you're going to be busy and have lots of good conversations.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Julian. Great to be here.
Thanks everyone for watching, and I look forward to bringing you more interviews from COP28 in the coming days.